The Mafia boss faked his own death, but his wife's reaction was not what he expected. Philip Dean watched his wife smile at his funeral. Not the broken, devastated smile of a grieving widow, the other kind. The kind that said she'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years.
He was supposed to be dead.
Gunned down in a parking garage, 3 bullets to the chest, closed casket, the whole city mourning. Except Philip wasn't in that casket. He was 2 miles away watching hidden cameras as his wife Laura walked into the hospital, mascara perfectly smudged, playing the role of her life. And then she asked the question that confirmed everything. When can I access the accounts? Not how did this happen? Not who did this to him. Just when do I get the money? Philip had staged his own assassination to answer one question. Did his wife love him? Or did she love what he could give her? In his world, the underworld, where he ruled with blood and fear, trust was a death sentence. Every smile hid a knife. Every kiss could be a setup. So he'd faked his death to see what Laura would do when she thought no one was watching. What she did was celebrate. Hidden cameras caught her on the phone that same night, voice light and happy. Finally, I've been waiting for this. Caught her meeting with a man, intimate, familiar. Caught her planning a future built on Philip's corpse. But here's what Philip didn't expect. While his wife was toasting champagne with her lover, someone else was falling apart. Maria, his second-in-command, refused to leave the funeral home. Slept in her car. Whispered to his closed casket like he could still hear her. You wouldn't leave me like this. 2 women. One celebrating his death.
One destroyed by it.
And Philip Dean, watching from the shadows, was about to learn that he'd been testing the wrong person all along. Because the conspiracy wasn't just about betrayal. It was about murder. And his wife didn't just wish him dead. She'd helped arrange it. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's go. Philip Dean sat alone in his office on the 42nd floor, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered with blood and calculated violence. From up here, the streets looked clean, almost innocent. But Philip knew better. He knew which corners belonged to him, which back rooms processed his money, which politicians wore his leash. He'd built an empire that made grown men stammer when they said his name. And yet, none of it could answer the one question poisoning his mind. His eyes shifted to the security monitor on his desk, the 4th screen from the left, the one he'd been staring at for the past 20 minutes. Laura moved through their bedroom, graceful and beautiful, wearing the diamond necklace he'd given her last month. She was on the phone, laughing at something the person on the other end said. Her smile looked genuine.
Warm. Real.
But then again, so did every other smile he'd seen seconds before a knife slid between someone's ribs. Philip leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. In his world, trust didn't exist. It was a luxury for people who'd never watched their own blood pool on concrete. Every handshake concealed an agenda. Every alliance was temporary. Every friend was one bad deal away from becoming an enemy. He'd learned that lesson early, and it had kept him alive when smarter men ended up in shallow graves. But Laura was supposed to be different. She was supposed to be the exception. He remembered their wedding day 3 years ago, the way she'd looked at him when he slipped the ring on her finger, tears glittering in her eyes. I love you, she'd whispered, and for a moment, for one impossible moment, Philip had let himself believe it. He'd let himself imagine that someone could love the man beneath the monster, that someone could see past the violence and the reputation and the blood on his hands. The memory twisted something in his chest. Because he'd heard those same words before, from people who disappeared the moment his money stopped flowing. From people who swore loyalty until a better offer came along. From people who smiled while sharpening their knives. The door to his office opened without a knock. Only one person in the entire organization had that privilege. Maria walked in carrying a tablet, her movements efficient and controlled the way they'd been for the past decade. His second-in-command, his right hand, the woman who'd taken bullets meant for him and never asked for anything in return except the chance to keep doing her job. She set the tablet on his desk, and her eyes flicked to the monitor showing Laura. The shipment from Miami cleared customs. Maria said, her voice all business. Then she paused, studying his face. You're not yourself, boss. Philip almost smiled at that. Maria noticed everything. It's what made her invaluable and occasionally uncomfortable. I'm fine, he said, but the lie tasted bitter. Maria didn't move. She stood there, waiting, the way she always did when she knew he was hiding something. After 10 years, she could read him better than anyone. Better than Laura, certainly. How do you test love? Philip asked quietly, still watching the monitor. When everyone fears you. The question hung in the air between them. Maria was silent for a long moment. You can't, she finally said. Fear and love don't occupy the same space. One always destroys the other. Philip looked up at her then, really looked at her. Maria had sharp features, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a scar along her jawline from the night she'd stepped between him and a rival's enforcer. She'd never been glamorous like Laura. Never wore designer dresses or diamonds. Never asked him for anything except loyalty in return for loyalty. What if I need to know? He said. Then you're asking the wrong question. Maria picked up the tablet, preparing to leave. The question isn't whether someone loves you. It's whether you're willing to accept what the answer might be. She left, the door clicking shut behind her, and Philip was alone again with his monitors and his doubt, and his empire that suddenly felt like a prison. On the screen, Laura ended her phone call. She stood in front of the mirror, admiring the necklace, running her fingers over the diamonds. Then she did something that made Philip's blood run cold. She smiled, not the warm, genuine smile she showed him. A different smile, satisfied, almost triumphant. It lasted only a second before she composed herself, but Philip had spent his entire life reading people's micro-expressions, the tiny tells that revealed truth beneath performance. And that smile told him everything and nothing all at once. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, on reading situations and making moves that others were too afraid to make. He'd survived in a world where hesitation meant death and trust was the fastest way to a funeral. Now he needed to make the most dangerous gamble of his life. Philip reached for his phone, scrolling to a name he hadn't called in years. A doctor. Discreet. Loyal. The kind of man who could make things look real when they weren't. In my world, Philip muttered to himself, love is the most dangerous gamble. But he was done gambling blind. He made the call, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. I need your help with something. Something that can't get back to anyone. He paused, watching Laura on the monitor as she left the bedroom, still wearing his diamonds, still carrying secrets he couldn't name. I need to know the truth, even if it destroys me. The words felt like a door closing and opening at the same time. The parking garage was perfect, concrete pillars creating blind spots, security cameras positioned exactly where Philip needed them, and enough distance from the street that screams would echo but not carry. Philip had chosen the location himself 3 days ago, the same way he'd chosen everything else about tonight. Control was the only thing keeping him from backing out. He sat in the back of a black SUV 2 blocks away, watching 6 different camera feeds on a monitor. Maria was beside him, so tense he could feel the energy radiating off her like heat. It's not too late, she said quietly. We can call it off. Philip shook his head. It's already too late. Has been for a long time. On the screen, his body double, a man named Carlo who'd worked for him for years, similar build, same hair color, walked toward the parking garage entrance. Carlo wore Philip's jacket, Philip's watch, even walked with Philip's measured stride. From a distance in dim lighting, he was perfect. Positions, Philip said into the radio. 3 men emerged from the shadows. One carried a gun loaded with blanks. The others would create the scene, the chaos, the witnesses, the blood that wasn't blood but looked real enough in darkness and panic. Philip's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd orchestrated dozens of actual hits, watched men die on his orders without losing sleep. But this felt different. This felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping someone had built a bridge he couldn't see. Boss, Maria's voice cracked slightly. What if she passes? What if we're wrong? Then I'll have my answer, Philip said, but even he could hear the hollowness in his words. The feeds showed Carlo reaching the second level. Right on schedule. Philip checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. Laura thought he was at a meeting with the Miami contacts. Wouldn't expect him home until after midnight. She'd be in the bedroom, probably on her phone, comfortable and unsuspecting. Execute, Philip said. The gunshots were deafening even through the speakers. 3 shots, carefully aimed to miss, but looked devastating. Carlo dropped exactly as they'd rehearsed, his body crumpling against a Mercedes, sliding down to the concrete. The blood capsules he wore under his shirt exploded on impact, spreading dark and viscous across his chest. The screaming started immediately. A woman who'd been planted as a witness ran toward the stairwell, her terror entirely real because she believed what she was seeing. 2 of Philip's men rushed to Carlo's body, shouting for someone to call an ambulance, their panic perfectly calibrated. And Philip watched it all unfold like a director watching his film, except this wasn't entertainment. This was the rest of his life. Jesus, Maria whispered. Even she, who knew it was staged, who'd helped plan every detail, looked shaken. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the seat. On another screen, Philip watched the 911 calls light up. Within minutes, sirens would arrive. The story would spread through the underworld like a virus. Philip Dean, untouchable king of the city, gunned down in a parking garage like any common street thug. His enemies would celebrate. His allies would scramble for position. And Laura would receive the call. Philip switched to the camera feed from their bedroom. She was exactly where he'd expected, propped against pillows with her phone, wearing one of her silk nightgowns that cost more than most people's cars. She looked relaxed. Content. Beautiful in the way that had made him stupid enough to let her in. His phone rang, the burner number only 3 people in the world knew. He answered without speaking. It's done, his contact at the police department said. Notifying next of kin now. Philip hung up and adjusted the camera angle, zooming in on Laura's face. His pulse was so loud in his ears he could barely hear Maria's shallow breathing beside him. The bedroom phone rang. Laura glanced at it, annoyed at the interruption, but picked up on the 3rd ring. Hello. Her voice was casual, maybe slightly irritated. Philip couldn't hear the other end, but he'd scripted every word. Mrs. Dean, this is Detective Morrison. There's been an incident. Your husband. I'm very sorry, but there's been a shooting. You need to come to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. He watched Laura's face, cataloging every micro-expression the way he'd learned to do in a world where missing a tell could get you killed. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly. Her free hand went to her throat, a gesture of shock that looked, to anyone watching, completely genuine. What? She said, her voice breaking.
No.
No, that's not. What hospital? Is he? Perfect performance. Award-winning. If Philip hadn't been looking for it, he might have missed what came next. I'm on my way, Laura said, and hung up the phone. For 3 seconds, she sat completely still. And then, so slowly that Philip almost thought he'd imagined it, the corner of her mouth curved upward. Not a full smile, she was too smart for that, too careful. But enough. Just enough to shatter every desperate hope Philip had been clutching. The expression was there and gone in a heartbeat, replaced immediately by appropriate shock and horror. She scrambled off the bed, reaching for her clothes, her movements frantic and bereaved. But Philip had seen it. That smile. That tiny, terrible moment of satisfaction before she remembered to perform. Maria made a sound beside him, something between a gasp and a sob. Philip, Don't, he said, his voice flat.
Dead.
Just don't. On the screen, Laura was already on her phone, calling someone. Her voice carried through the audio feed, choked with tears that sounded so real Philip wanted to believe them even now. Something happened to Philip. They said there was a shooting. I have to go to the hospital. I'll call you later. She hung up and stared at herself in the mirror, composing her face. Practicing grief. Making sure the mask fit perfectly. Philip felt something cold settle in his chest, spreading through his veins like ice water.
This was what truth felt like.
This was the answer he'd been terrified to find. What Philip saw in that moment would change everything, Maria said quietly, echoing his own thoughts. On the screen, Laura grabbed her keys and ran for the door, her performance flawless now. The devastated wife rushing to her husband's side, ready to play her part in front of cameras and witnesses and a city that would watch her mourn. But Philip had already seen behind the mask, and there was no coming back from that. What Philip saw in that moment would change everything. But before we reveal Laura's true reaction, if you're already hooked by this story of loyalty, betrayal, and dangerous love, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will shock you even more than it shocked Philip. The morning after Philip's death, the city moved differently. News had spread through the underworld like poison in water, whispered in back rooms, confirmed through encrypted channels, celebrated quietly by men who'd waited years for an opening. Philip Dean, the king who couldn't be killed, had finally fallen. Philip watched it all from the safe house, 3 monitors showing different feeds of a world rearranging itself in his absence. Rival families making calls. His own lieutenants scrambling to secure territory. The delicate ecosystem he'd built with blood and fear beginning to shift and crack. But his eyes kept returning to one screen. The one showing Laura. She'd transformed their bedroom into a war room of grief management. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Condolence calls she answered with a voice thick with tears, each conversation a masterpiece of controlled emotion. Between calls, her face went blank, almost bored, before reconstructing itself the moment the next ring came. "She's meeting with your lawyer at 11, Maria said, reviewing the schedule Laura's assistant had sent out. "Then lunch with your accountant. At 2, she's scheduled a meeting with the funeral director." Philip checked his watch. 9:47 a.m. Laura had been a widow for less than 12 hours, and she was already managing his estate like a hostile takeover. "Show me the funeral home," he said. Maria switched feeds, and Philip's breath caught in his throat. The parking lot of Morrison's funeral home filled the screen, a modest space behind the building where families usually park discreetly. But there, in the far corner near the dumpsters, sat a black Honda Civic that Philip recognized immediately. Maria's personal car, the one she drove when she wasn't on business. "Wait," Philip leaned forward. "Is that?" "I went there last night," Maria said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "After the hospital." On the screen, Maria emerged from the funeral home's back entrance, her face ravaged in a way Philip had never seen. Her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, her hair uncombed. She walked like someone physically injured, each step an effort. When she reached her car, she didn't get in. She just stood there, one hand on the door handle, staring back at the building. "You stayed all night?" Philip asked. Maria's jaw tightened. "I couldn't leave. I kept thinking." She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But Philip was already rewinding the footage, watching the timestamp. Maria had arrived at 11:43 p.m. and hadn't left until 7:22 a.m. 8 hours. She'd spent 8 hours in that parking lot. "Show me interior cameras," Philip said. "Boss, you don't need to." "Show me." Maria pulled up the funeral home's security footage, the cameras she'd accessed 2 days ago, when they were planning the location for Carlo's body. The viewing room appeared on screen, dark except for emergency lighting, the closed casket on a raised platform surrounded by flowers that had been delivered throughout the night. And there, at 2:17 a.m., was Maria. She'd somehow gotten inside, past the locked doors, into the viewing room. She stood in front of the casket, her hand pressed against the polished wood, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. Her lips moved, and Philip adjusted the audio, straining to hear the whispered words. "This isn't real," Maria was saying, her voice broken. "You wouldn't leave like this. You wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. You wouldn't leave me." The last word cracked something in Philip's chest.
Me.
Not us. Not the organization or the empire or the business.
Me.
Philip hadn't slept in 43 hours. His eyes burned from staring at monitors. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't look away. Watching Laura was like watching a snake shed its skin. each layer of the performance falling away when she thought no one was looking. Day 2 of his death, and she'd already met with 3 lawyers, 2 accountants, and his primary banker. All business. All efficiency. The grieving widow who somehow had perfect clarity about asset liquidation and account transfers. "She's moving fast," Maria said, her voice hoarse. She'd finally left the funeral home that morning after Philip had actually ordered, her to go home and shower. She'd obeyed, but only because he'd made it clear she was more useful to him functional than collapsed. Now she sat beside him, hair still damp, dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. "She's been planning this," Philip muttered, watching Laura in her bedroom, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine. "This isn't improvisation. She knew exactly what to do the moment I died." On the screen, Laura's phone rang. She checked the caller ID, and something in her expression shifted.
Softened.
She answered with a voice Philip had never heard her use with him. Warm, intimate, unguarded. "Hey baby," she said, and Philip's hands clenched. Maria leaned forward, adjusting the audio feed. They'd been waiting for this call, the one Laura had made the night of his death. The mystery man on the other end who'd been promised payment, promised freedom, promised Laura. "God, I miss you," Laura continued, settling back against the pillows. "This performance is exhausting. Do you know how many times I've had to cry today? My eyes actually hurt." A pause while the man responded. "3 more days until the funeral," Laura said. "Then we wait the appropriate mourning period, 6 months, the lawyer said. Maybe less if I play it right. After that." She smiled, the real smile Philip was beginning to recognize. "After that, we're free. Finally free." Philip switched to the backup camera, the one with facial recognition software running. "Can you trace the call?" "Already on it," Maria said, fingers flying across her tablet. "Burner phone, but I'm tracking the cell tower."
Got it.
"Location is the Meridian Hotel downtown, room 847. Philip's pulse quickened. "Can you get me visuals?" "The hotel has cameras in the hallways, but not inside rooms." "Wait." Maria pulled up traffic camera footage from the street outside the Meridian.
There.
Black Escalade, with diplomatic plates parked in the loading zone. "That's unusual. Let me run the registration." While Maria worked, Philip kept watching Laura. She'd gotten up, walking to her closet, phone pressed to her ear. "I'm thinking Valentino for the funeral," she was saying, running her hand over black dresses. "Elegant but not too flashy. I need to look devastated but not destroyed, like a woman who could rebuild. The families need to see me as an asset, not a liability." The man said something that made Laura laugh, genuine, unrestrained laughter that Philip had rarely heard in 3 years of marriage. "Oh, please," Laura said. Philip was so paranoid he could barely function. All that power, and he spent his life jumping at shadows. It would be pathetic if it wasn't so profitable. She selected a dress, holding it up to her body. The irony is, he was right to be paranoid. He just never suspected the right person. Something cold slithered down Philip's spine. "Boss," Maria's voice was tight. "The Escalade is registered to Marcus Valdez." Philip's head snapped toward her. "Valdez? As in the Valdez family?" Maria nodded, her face grim. Marcus Valdez was the underboss of their biggest rival organization, a man Philip had been in a Cold War with for 5 years. They'd maintained an uneasy truce, both sides too powerful to attack directly, without massive casualties. But if that truce was broken, if Marcus had found a way inside Philip's organization, how long? Philip asked, his voice deadly quiet. Maria pulled up more footage, cross-referencing dates from the hotel's parking records. "The Escalade has been there every Thursday for the past 8 months. Same room. Same time. 8 months. Philip felt something inside him turn to ice. 8 months of Thursday meetings while he'd thought Laura was at yoga class or lunch with friends. 8 months of planning, positioning, waiting for the right moment to strike. On the screen, Laura was still talking. "The funeral is the perfect opportunity. All the family heads in one place, paying respects. I'll be making connections, showing strength. By the time 6 months pass, Half of them will already see me as Philip's natural successor. You're not taking over his territory, Marcus said. Philip could finally hear the other side of the conversation as Maria boosted the signal. That was never the deal. The deal, Laura's voice cooled, was that I deliver Philip to you, and in return, I get his assets. His money. His properties. That was always the deal, Marcus. Plans change, Marcus said. With Philip gone, there's a power vacuum. My family is moving in. You'll get your money, but the territory is ours. Laura's jaw tightened. We had an agreement, and we'll honor it. Just not exactly how you pictured. Marcus's voice turned smooth, placating. Baby, be reasonable. You don't want to run a criminal empire. You want the lifestyle, the freedom. I can give you that. We can be together, travel, live anywhere you want. Isn't that what you really wanted? Philip watched Laura's face, seeing the calculation there. She was being played, manipulated by a man who was better at this game than she was. And she was just beginning to realize it. Of course, Laura finally said, but her smile was forced. You're right. I don't want the empire. I just want us. That's my girl, Marcus said. I'll see you after the funeral. We'll celebrate properly then. They said their goodbyes, and Laura hung up, but her expression had transformed. The soft, loving mask was gone, replaced by something calculating and cold. She stared at her reflection in the closet mirror, and Philip could practically see her mind working. She betrayed Philip to be with Marcus. But Marcus was already betraying her, planning to take everything and give her just enough to keep her compliant. She'd traded one cage for another, and she was only now seeing the bars. She helped set you up, Maria said, her voice shaking with rage. She's been working with Valdez for 8 months. This wasn't just about testing if she loved you, Philip. She helped arrange your murder. Philip felt the words land like bullets, each one finding a vital organ. The car accident he'd staged had been meant to reveal her heart. But the real assassination, the one that was supposed to happen, had been planned by his wife and his greatest enemy. The security breach 3 months ago, Philip said slowly, pieces falling into place. The one where our safe house locations got leaked to the Russians. Laura, Maria confirmed, pulling up records. She had access to your phone, your computer. She fed him everything. On the screen, Laura poured herself another glass of wine, her hand trembling slightly. She picked up her phone, scrolling to a different number. Not Marcus. Someone else. She dialed, and when the person answered, her voice was different again. Harder. More desperate.
We need to talk, Laura said. About the plan.
About what happens after the funeral. She paused, listening. No, I don't trust him anymore. Marcus is going to cut me out. I can feel it. Another pause. Then we need a backup plan. Something that ensures I get what I'm owed, with or without Marcus Valdez. She hung up and drained her wine in one long swallow, and Philip finally understood the full scope of what he was seeing. Laura wasn't just betraying him. She was betraying everyone, playing multiple sides, ensuring that no matter what happened, she'd come out on top. Or so she thought. How deep does this go? Philip asked. Maria's tablet chimed with an alert. She looked at the screen, and her face went pale. Boss, you need to see this. I pulled the financial records you asked for. There are payments going back 18 months. Not 8 months. 18. She turned the tablet toward him, showing a series of wire transfers from accounts Laura had access to, accounts Philip had trusted her with for household expenses and charitable donations. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, moved in small increments to offshore holdings registered to shell corporations. She's been stealing from you for a year and a half, Maria said. And these payments, some of them line up with dates when we had security issues. The ambush last November that nearly killed you. The warehouse fire that destroyed 3 months of inventory. The witness who disappeared before he could testify. Philip stared at the numbers, each one a small betrayal that added up to something enormous. Laura hadn't just planned his death. She'd been sabotaging him, bleeding him, weakening him for over a year. Every kiss had been a lie. Every I love you had been strategy. Every night she'd slept beside him. She'd been counting down to his death. I wanted to be wrong, Philip had said 2 days ago. Now, staring at the evidence of 18 months of calculated treachery, he understood just how comprehensively right he'd been, and how close he'd come to dying without ever knowing. What Philip saw in that moment would change everything. But before we reveal Laura's true reaction, if you're already hooked by this story of loyalty, betrayal, and dangerous love, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will shock you even more than it shocked Philip. While Laura celebrated with champagne and conspiracy, Maria declared war. Philip watched her on the monitors, tracking her movements through the city like following a predator on the hunt. She'd left the safe house 3 hours ago with a tablet full of evidence and a fury that radiated through every surveillance feed. No sleep, barely eating, running on grief and rage, and a determination that frightened even him. Where is she now? Philip asked into his secure phone. His tech guy, Danny, pulled up the GPS tracker in Maria's car, heading to the docks. The warehouse district. Philip's stomach dropped. That's Sal Romano's territory. Yeah, Danny confirmed. And she just parked outside his headquarters. Philip switched to traffic cameras, catching Maria's car pulling up to a building that everyone in the underworld knew belonged to one of his most volatile allies. Sal Romano ran the port operations, controlled the shipping lanes, and had a temper that had ended more than one negotiation with bloodshed. "Get me audio," Philip snapped. The camera showed Maria exiting her car, and Philip's breath caught. She wasn't dressed like his second-in-command anymore. She looked feral, her usual composed professionalism replaced by something raw and dangerous. She walked straight to the entrance, where 2 of Sal's men stood guard. "I need to see Sal," Maria said, her voice flat.
Now.
The guards looked at each other. One of them, a guy named Tony who Philip had met a dozen times, shook his head. "Miss Torres, with all due respect, now's not a good time. With Mr. Dean gone, things are." Maria moved so fast the camera almost missed it. One moment she was standing still, the next she had Tony's arm twisted behind his back and his face pressed against the brick wall. "Philip Dean is dead because someone betrayed him, and I'm going to find out who. Now you can either let me in or I can go through you. Your choice." Tony nodded frantically, and Maria released him. The guards stepped aside. Philip leaned closer to the monitor, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He'd always known Maria was capable. She'd proven herself 100 times over the years. But this was different. This wasn't the composed professional who executed his orders with precision. This was someone who'd taken off the leash. The interior cameras showed Maria storming into Sal's office without knocking. Sal looked up from his desk, his 3 bodyguards immediately reaching for weapons. But Sal held up a hand, stopping them. "Maria," Sal said carefully, "I heard about Philip. Terrible thing. If there's anything—" "Someone betrayed him," Maria interrupted, slamming her tablet on Sal's desk. "Someone with inside knowledge of his movements, his security protocols, his safe houses. And I'm going to find them." Sal's expression flickered. Uncertainty, maybe fear. "You think one of us. I think everyone's a suspect until I clear them." Maria's voice could have cut steel. "Including you, Sal. So, I'm going to ask you once. Have you been in contact with the Valdez family in the last 6 months?" "The Valdez family?" Sal's surprise looked genuine. "Are you insane? Philip would have killed me himself if I'd." "Philip's dead," Maria said, and her voice cracked on the word before hardening again. "So now you answer to me. Have you been in contact with the Valdez family?" Sal stared at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head.
No.
"And if I find out any of my guys have been, I'll deliver their heads to you personally. Philip and I had our differences, but we had respect. He built something worth protecting, and I'm not letting vultures pick it apart." Maria studied him, her body language still coiled and ready to strike. Finally, she nodded.
"Good.
Because if I find out you're lying, what Philip would have done to you will look like mercy compared to what I'll do." She grabbed her tablet and left without another word, leaving Sal staring after her with something that looked like awe mixed with terror. Philip switched cameras, following Maria as she drove to her next destination, the financial district, where his accountant kept offices. Then to the club where his money laundering operations ran through the books. Then to a warehouse in Queens where his weapons supplier operated. Each stop followed the same pattern. Maria walking in like an avenging angel, demanding answers, threatening consequences, leaving a trail of nervous allies who suddenly understood that Philip's death didn't mean the end of accountability. If anything, Maria's grief had made her more dangerous than Philip had ever been. "She's building a case," Danny said, watching the same feeds. Cross-referencing everyone's stories, looking for inconsistencies. "She's protecting my empire," Philip said quietly, "even though she thinks I'm dead." By sunset, Maria had interviewed 17 of Philip's key people. The surveillance footage showed her growing more exhausted with each meeting, the dark circles under her eyes deepening, her movements getting slower. But she didn't stop. At 11:47 p.m., the cameras caught her pulling back into the Morrison Funeral Home parking lot. Philip's heart clenched as he watched her park in the same spot she'd occupied for 2 days, cut the engine, and just sit there staring at the building. "Boss," Danny said carefully, "you want me to keep recording?" Philip should have said no. Should have given her privacy. But he couldn't look away. Maria sat in her car for 20 minutes before finally getting out. She walked to the funeral home's back entrance. She'd obviously figured out how to bypass the security and disappeared inside. The interior cameras showed her entering the viewing room, where Carlo's casket still lay. The funeral was tomorrow. After that, the body would be cremated, and this charade would move into its next phase. Maria approached the casket slowly, like she was walking through water. When she reached it, she placed both hands on the polished wood and dropped her head. "I found something," she whispered. "Laura's been working with Marcus Valdez. They planned this, Philip. Your own wife helped kill you." Philip's throat tightened. "I have evidence," Maria continued. "Financial records, phone logs, everything we need to prove it. But I don't know what to do with it. You always knew what to do. You always had a plan." Her voice broke. "I don't know how to do this without you." She stayed there, hands pressed to the casket like she could absorb comfort through the wood. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft Philip had to increase the volume to hear. "I should have told you years ago," Maria said. "Should have been brave enough to say it out loud. But you looked at her like she hung the moon, and I couldn't ruin that for you. So I stayed quiet, stayed professional, stayed safe." A bitter laugh. "And now you're gone, and I never got to tell you that I—" She stopped, pressing her forehead against the casket. "I loved you," she finally whispered. "Not like a boss or a friend or a partner. I loved you the way she pretended to, the way you deserved to be loved. And I was too much of a coward to tell you." Silence filled the viewing room. Maria's shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Philip couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process what he was hearing. "I would have taken a bullet for you," Maria said. "I would have died 1,000 deaths if it meant you kept breathing." And her voice turned sharp, angry. "She gets to be your widow. She gets to mourn you publicly while I hide in parking lots and break into funeral homes just to feel close to you." She straightened, wiping her face with trembling hands. "But I promise you this," Maria said, her voice steady now, resolved. "I'm going to protect everything you built. I'm going to find everyone who betrayed you. And I'm going to make sure Laura Dean pays for every lie she ever told you. That's my promise. That's what I can give you now that I couldn't give you before." She kissed her fingers and pressed them to the casket one last time. Then she turned and walked out, her spine straight, her purpose clear. Philip sat in the safe house, staring at the screen long after Maria had returned to her car. His mind was reeling, trying to reconcile 10 years of professional partnership with what he'd just heard. Maria had loved him. Not the empire, not the power, not what he could give her. Him. And he'd been so fixated on Laura, glamorous, calculated Laura, that he'd never seen what was right beside him. "Boss." Danny's voice was hesitant. "You okay?" Philip wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. But watching Maria's car on the monitor, watching her keep vigil over a man she thought was dead while his actual widow planned her next move with his enemies. Philip finally understood something fundamental. He'd tested the wrong person. The woman who loved him had been proving it every day for a decade, taking bullets, making sacrifices, standing beside him when there was nothing to gain except danger and loyalty returned. She'd never needed to be tested because she'd been showing him the truth all along. He'd just been too blind to see it. Philip Dean built his empire by knowing when someone was playing him, but he never saw this coming. His wife's betrayal was deeper than he imagined, and what he's about to discover will turn this test into something far more dangerous. If you're invested in seeing how this unfolds, subscribe now, because Maria is about to uncover a truth that will change everything. Maria arrived at the safe house at 4:17 a.m. carrying 3 laptops, 2 external hard drives, and a manila folder thick enough to be a weapon. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, because she hadn't. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, coffee stains on her shirt. But her expression was sharp, focused, dangerous. "I found it," she said, dropping everything on the table in front of Philip. All of it. Philip had been awake too, unable to rest after watching her confession at the funeral home. Seeing her now, exhausted but triumphant, driven by something stronger than sleep or food or self-preservation, made his chest ache in ways he didn't have words for.
"Show me," he said.
Maria opened the first laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I started with the financial irregularities I noticed 3 months ago. The accounts that didn't quite balance. Small discrepancies, nothing that would raise alarms, but consistent. Always on Thursdays." She pulled up spreadsheets that made Philip's blood run cold. Transfers from his operational accounts, money for payroll, for bribes, for the 1,000 small expenses that kept an empire running, being siphoned off in amounts ranging from $5,000 to $20,000. Over 18 months, it added up to nearly $2 million. "Thursdays," Philip said slowly. "Laura's yoga days." "Exactly." Maria opened another window, showing security footage from their home's garage. Every Thursday for 18 months, Laura left at 10 a.m. and returned around 2 p.m. She told you she was at yoga and lunch with friends. The footage showed Laura getting into her Mercedes, but Maria had tracked the car's GPS. Instead of heading to the upscale gym she claimed to attend, the Mercedes went straight to the Meridian Hotel downtown. "Room 847, Maria said. "Registered to a shell corporation called Apex Holdings." "Guess who owns Apex Holdings?" "Marcus Valdez," Philip said, though saying the name out loud made it feel more real, more crushing. "Every Thursday for 18 months, Maria continued, pulling up hotel security footage she'd somehow acquired. The video showed Laura entering the hotel, taking the elevator to the 8th floor, and disappearing into room 847. 2 hours later, she'd emerge, hair fixed, makeup perfect, looking satisfied. She wasn't just sleeping with him, Philip. She was briefing him. Maria opened the third laptop, showing encrypted communications she'd cracked through channels Philip didn't want to think about. Messages between Laura and Marcus, dated and time-stamped, a chronicle of betrayal so comprehensive it felt like reading his own autopsy report. "Laura, he's changing security protocols again. New routes, new safe houses. I'll get you the updated information by Thursday. Marcus, you're invaluable, baby. Once this is over, we'll have everything. Laura, I'm tired of playing housewife to a paranoid criminal. How much longer? Marcus, soon. The pieces are almost in place." Philip scrolled through message after message, each one a small death. Laura discussing his schedules, his meetings, his vulnerabilities. Marcus strategizing how to take over territory once Philip was eliminated. Both of them planning a future built on his corpse. "The ambush last November," Maria said quietly. "The one where you were nearly killed outside the restaurant. Look at the date of this message." She highlighted a conversation from 3 days before the ambush. "Laura, he's meeting with the Russians on Thursday night. Gino's Steakhouse, 8 p.m. Light security because he thinks the location is secure. Marcus, perfect. We'll have people in position." Philip remembered that night with horrible clarity. For men with automatic weapons, appearing from nowhere, cutting down 2 of his bodyguards before he'd managed to escape through the kitchen. He'd chalked it up to bad luck, to the Russians playing dirty. He'd never suspected. "She set you up to die," Maria said, and her voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. "8 months ago. This wasn't a new plan. She's been trying to kill you for over a year." Philip couldn't speak. His hands were clenched, so tight his knuckles had gone white. Maria pulled up more evidence. The warehouse fire that destroyed 3 months of inventory?
Laura.
The witness who disappeared before the federal trial? Laura gave Marcus his location. The security breach that leaked our safe house addresses? Laura had access to your encrypted files. She photographed the documents and sent them straight to Marcus. Each revelation was a bullet, and Philip felt them all land. His wife, the woman he'd shared a bed with, the woman he'd trusted with access to his life, had been systematically dismantling everything he'd built. "There's more," Maria said, and her voice had gone cold. "The hit in the parking garage. The one that was supposed to kill you. That was supposed to be real." She pulled up the final piece of evidence, communications between Marcus and a hitman named Dmitry Sokolov, a Russian contractor known for making deaths look like random violence. Marcus, Thursday night. Parking garage at the building on 5th. He'll be alone, minimal security. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Dmitry, price is $500K. Half up front. Marcus, done. Just make sure it's clean. The wife needs plausible deniability. The message was dated 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks before Philip had staged his own death. "Your paranoia saved your life," Maria said. "When you decided to fake your death instead of going to that meeting, you used Carlo as a double. You changed the security team at the last minute. Marcus's people were probably waiting at the real location, but you never showed up. So when our staged assassination happened in the same parking garage, but on a different night with different players, everyone assumed it was connected to your enemies making a move. No one knew it was supposed to happen for real." Philip stared at the screen, his mind racing. If he hadn't decided to test Laura, if he'd gone to that meeting as planned, Dmitry Sokolov would have been waiting. Real bullets. Real death. And Laura would have played the grieving widow while Marcus carved up his empire. "She didn't just wish you dead," Maria continued. "She paid for it.
Look."
She showed him bank records, transfers from accounts Laura controlled, routed through 3 different shell corporations, ultimately ending up in an account registered to Dmitry Sokolov. $250,000. Down payment on Philip's murder. "The security team she recommended last month," Maria said. "The ones you almost hired. 3 of them have connections to the Valdez family. She was trying to get people in place who would look the other way when Dmitry made his move." Philip felt something inside him crystallize, the last remnants of his marriage turning to ice and shattering. Laura hadn't just betrayed him. She'd orchestrated his assassination with the precision of a military operation, using his own money, exploiting his trust, planning to profit from his death while sleeping beside him every night. "How long have you known?" Philip asked. "I suspected something 3 months ago when the accounts didn't balance. But I didn't have proof, and I couldn't come to you with suspicions about your wife." Maria's jaw tightened. "I started investigating on my own. Quietly. Following her on Thursdays, tracking her movements, pulling financial records. I was going to tell you once I had everything solid. And then I staged my death." "And then you staged your death," Maria confirmed. "Which is probably the only reason you're still alive. If you'd confronted her with half-formed suspicions, she would have warned Marcus. They would have accelerated their timeline. You'd be actually dead right now." Philip stood, pacing the small safe house like a caged animal. 18 months of deception. 18 months of sleeping beside someone who was counting down to his murder. Every kiss had been strategy. Every "I love you" had been cover. Every intimate moment had been part of a long con that ended with him in a grave and Laura counting his money. "There's one more thing," Maria said quietly. "And you're not going to like it." Philip turned to face her, and the expression on her face made his stomach drop. She pulled up one final document, a contract signed and notarized. Marcus and Laura drew up an agreement. After your death, she gets 50% of your liquid assets, everything in the accounts, the properties, the investments. Marcus gets control of the territory and the operational businesses. They split power down the middle. Except, Philip said, seeing where this was going. Except Marcus has no intention of honoring that agreement, Maria finished. I found these messages from 2 days ago, after your death. Marcus is already planning to push her out. Give her enough money to disappear quietly, maybe 5 or 10 million, and keep the rest. He's been using her to get to you, and now that you're gone, she's a liability he plans to eliminate. Philip almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Laura had betrayed him to be with Marcus, and Marcus was already betraying her. She'd traded one cage for another, and she was too arrogant to see it. She has no idea, Maria said. She thinks she's going to be a queen. But Marcus sees her as a useful idiot who served her purpose. Once the funeral is over and the assets are transferred, I'd give her 3 months before she has an unfortunate accident. Philip looked at Maria, really looked at her. She'd spent 72 hours without sleep, hunting through evidence, building a case against his wife, protecting his empire even though she thought he was dead. Her loyalty was so absolute it was almost painful to witness. Why? Philip asked. Why go through all this? I'm dead, Maria. You could have walked away, taken your share and disappeared. Started over somewhere safe. Maria's eyes met his, and for a moment, the exhaustion fell away, revealing something raw and honest underneath. Because you deserved better than this, she said simply. You deserved better than her lies and Marcus's betrayal and dying without knowing the truth. And because she stopped, looked away. Because some of us loved you enough to fight for you even after you're gone. The words hung in the air between them, and Philip understood with perfect clarity what he'd been too blind to see for 10 years. Someone betrayed you, Philip, Maria said, her voice hardening as she turned back to the evidence. And I'm going to find everyone involved. I'm going to dismantle this conspiracy piece by piece. And then I'm going to make sure Laura Dean and Marcus Valdez pay for every lie they ever told you. Philip watched her dive back into the laptops, her focus absolute, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent 3 days testing the wrong person while the right one had been beside him all along, proving her loyalty through action rather than words. The funeral was tomorrow. Time to end this charade. Time to show Laura and Marcus what happened when you tried to bury a man who'd already survived his own death. Time to resurrect. The Morrison funeral home was packed by 10 a.m. Philip watched on the monitors as black cars lined the street. Every major family in the city, allies and enemies alike, all coming to pay respects to a dead king. Or to confirm he was actually gone. Maria sat beside him in the safe house, wearing the black dress she'd chosen for this performance. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, but her eyes were sharp. Ready. Last chance to call this off, she said quietly. Philip shook his head. They're all there. Everyone who matters. Everyone who betrayed me. Everyone who stayed loyal. Everyone who's been waiting for this moment. He looked at her. It ends today. On the screen, Laura made her entrance like a movie star. The black Valentino dress fit perfectly. Elegant, expensive, designed to suggest devastation without actually looking devastated. She wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, hiding eyes that Philip knew weren't crying. The mourners parted for her, murmuring condolences that she accepted with practiced grace. She walked to the closed casket at the front of the room, placed one hand on the polished wood, and bowed her head in what was supposed to look like prayer. Philip zoomed in on her face. Behind the sunglasses, her expression was blank. Bored, almost. She was counting down the minutes until this performance ended. Marcus Valdez entered 10 minutes later with his entourage, 6 bodyguards, all armed, all alert. He moved through the crowd like he owned it, shaking hands, making connections, positioning himself as the natural successor to Philip's power. When he reached Laura, he touched her elbow with casual familiarity, leaning in to whisper something that made her lips tighten. He's already moving on your territory, Maria said, checking her tablet. 3 of your warehouses hit with inspections this morning. His people, wearing official badges. They're not waiting 6 months. They're starting the takeover today. Philip's hands clenched, but his voice stayed calm. Let them. Makes this easier. The eulogy began at 10:30. Sal Romano spoke first, his words appropriately respectful, talking about Philip's strength, his vision, his iron control. Then Anthony Russo, one of Philip's oldest allies, speaking about loyalty and respect and the end of an era. Then Laura stood to speak. The room went silent. Every camera in the funeral home focused on her as she approached the podium, removing her sunglasses to reveal red-rimmed eyes that Maria had probably helped her fake with makeup tricks. She gripped the podium like she needed it for support, her voice trembling when she spoke. Philip was my everything, Laura began, and Philip felt his jaw clench. My protector, my love, my reason for breathing. When I married him, I knew the risks. I knew the dangers of his world. But I also knew that loving him was worth any risk. Maria made a sound of disgust beside him. He built an empire with his strength, Laura continued, but he built a home with his heart. Every day with him was a gift. Every moment was precious. And now, her voice broke perfectly, and several people in the crowd wiped their own eyes. Now I have to find a way to keep breathing in a world without him. Jesus, Maria muttered. She should get an Oscar. She will, Philip said quietly. Just not the kind she's expecting. A mourner approached Laura as she descended from the podium, an older woman named Rosa, who ran one of the gambling operations. At least you'll be taken care of, dear, Rosa said, patting Laura's hand. Philip was always generous with his provisions. For just a fraction of a second, Laura's mouth curved upward. A flash of satisfaction, of triumph, before she caught herself and forced tears back into her eyes. He was, she said. He really was. The camera panned to the back of the room, where Maria had positioned herself. She stood alone, separate from the crowd, her grief so raw it looked like physical pain. When another mourner, a man named Vincent who'd worked with Philip for 20 years, approached her with condolences, Maria's expression transformed to pure rage. Don't, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the room. Don't you dare pretend you cared about him. Vincent stepped back, startled. Maria, He built everything you have, Maria continued, her voice rising. Every dollar in your pocket, every inch of territory you control, every breath you take in this city, you owe it to him. And now he's dead, and you're all here playing dress-up, pretending to mourn while you circle like vultures waiting to pick his empire apart. The room had gone completely silent. Laura turned, her expression flickering between annoyance and calculated concern. Maria, Laura said, her voice gentle, sympathetic. We're all grieving. We all loved Philip. You didn't love him, Maria snapped, and Philip saw the moment everyone in the room tensed. You don't get to say that. You don't get to stand there in your designer dress and your fake tears and pretend. Two of the funeral home staff moved toward Maria, but she shook them off, her eyes locked on Laura with an intensity that made even Philip's blood run cold. I know what you are, Maria said quietly, but the words carried in the silent room. And he knew too. Laura's face went carefully blank. You're not yourself, Maria. Grief does terrible things. Don't, Maria whispered. Don't pretend. Not here. Not now. Security finally escorted Maria out, her body rigid with fury, and the room exhaled collectively. Laura composed herself, dabbing at her eyes, accepting comfort from Rosa and others who murmured about how grief affects people differently. But Philip had seen Laura's expression in that moment when Maria had said he knew too. The flash of panic, quickly buried. The calculation behind her eyes. The service ended at noon. Mourners filed past the casket one final time, each paying their respects. Laura lingered the longest, alone with the casket, and Philip adjusted the audio to hear her whispered words. Thank you for being stupid enough to trust me, she said, so quietly no one else could hear. She touched the casket one last time, and then she smiled, that real smile Philip had learned to recognize. Goodbye, Philip. Enjoy your eternity. She walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and Philip stood from his chair for the first time in 3 days. "It's time," he said. Maria looked up at him, and something fierce and wild flashed in her eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Philip adjusted his jacket, checking the gun at his hip. "They want to warn me? Fine. Let them come together. Let them all be in one place with their guards down and their conspiracies exposed." His voice turned cold, deadly. "Let them come to bury a dead man. I'll show them what resurrection looks like." Maria stood beside him, and for the first time in 72 hours, she smiled. Not with happiness, but with the satisfaction of a soldier finally given permission to fight. "Then let's go remind them," she said, "why you don't kill a king unless you're absolutely sure he's dead." The gathering happened at the Belmore estate, a sprawling mansion in the hills that had been neutral territory for decades. It was where the families came together for weddings, funerals, and the rare moments when the underworld needed to present a united front. Tonight, it was supposed to be a reception following Philip Dean's funeral. A chance for allies to pledge support to his widow, for rivals to stake their claims, for the power vacuum to begin its inevitable collapse into chaos. Philip watched the arrivals from a van parked 2 blocks away, Maria beside him, both of them armed and dressed for war. "Everyone's here," Maria confirmed, checking her tablet. "All 5 family heads. Marcus brought his entire inner circle. Laura's already inside, playing the grieving widow." Philip's reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, a dead man about to crash his own wake. He'd shaved, put on his best suit, the one Laura had always said made him look invincible. Tonight, he needed to look exactly like what he was, a king reclaiming his throne. "You ready?" Maria asked. Philip looked at her, really looked at her. 3 days ago, he'd trusted the wrong woman. But Maria had spent those same 3 days proving everything words couldn't say, protecting his empire, mourning him genuinely, uncovering the conspiracy that would have ended him. "I'm ready," he said. "But Maria, after tonight, everything changes. You understand that." She met his eyes, and something passed between them that didn't need explanation. "I know." "Good." Philip checked his gun one last time. "Then let's show them what happens when you try to bury a man who refuses to stay dead." They approached the estate on foot, moving through shadows that Philip had memorized years ago. The security was heavy but predictable. Marcus's men at the front, trying to look respectful while really establishing dominance. Philip's own former guards mixed in, looking uncertain about who they worked for now. None of them were watching the service entrance. Maria bypassed the security system with practiced efficiency. She designed half of it, after all. They slipped inside through the kitchen, moving through corridors filled with catering staff too busy to notice 2 more people in formal wear. The main ballroom was ahead, filled with the low murmur of hundreds of conversations, the clink of champagne glasses, the sound of an empire being carved up by people who thought its king was dead. Philip paused at the door, his hand on the handle, his heart steady despite what he was about to do. Through the small window, he could see them all. Sal Romano talking with Anthony Russo, discussing territory divisions. The Carver brothers negotiating shipping routes. And at the center of it all, Laura in her black dress, surrounded by family heads offering condolences and thinly veiled propositions. Marcus stood beside her, his hand proprietary on her lower back, already positioning her as his asset rather than Philip's widow. "Now or never," Maria whispered. Philip pushed open the doors. The ballroom didn't go silent all at once. It was gradual, a ripple effect as people nearest the entrance stopped mid-sentence, their faces draining of color, their champagne glasses freezing halfway to their lips. The silence spread like a wave through the crowd until even Laura, holding court at the far end, turned to see what had caused the disruption. Her face went white as marble. Philip walked into the room like he owned it because he did. Every eye followed him, mouths hanging open, some people taking involuntary steps backward, as if confronted by a ghost. Maria flanked him, her hand near her weapon, her expression daring anyone to move. "Good evening," Philip said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Laura's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. Marcus moved first, his hand going for his weapon, but Maria was faster. She had her gun out and aimed at his head before he'd cleared his jacket. "I wouldn't," she said calmly. 6 of Philip's guards, the ones who'd stayed truly loyal, materialized from positions around the room, weapons drawn, covering the exits. This had been planned down to the second, choreographed like a military operation. Philip kept walking, his eyes locked on Laura, watching as shock transformed to confusion, confusion to recognition, recognition to absolute terror. Her lover stood frozen beside her, caught between reaching for his weapon and accepting that he was already dead. "Surprised to see me?" Philip asked, stopping 10 feet from Laura, close enough to see every micro-expression, every calculation happening behind her eyes. "You shouldn't be. You of all people know how paranoid I am." "Philip," Laura's voice came out strangled. You were..."
Dead.
Philip smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "Yes, I was. Very publicly, very convincingly dead. You mourned beautifully, by the way. That eulogy had me almost convinced you cared." The crowd remained frozen, watching this impossible resurrection play out. Some looked relieved, his true allies, who genuinely mourned him. Others looked terrified, already calculating how badly they'd miscalculated. "I don't understand," Laura managed, but her eyes were darting to Marcus, to the exits, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. "Don't you?" Philip took another step closer. "Let me help you understand. 3 days ago, I faked my death. Not because I was in danger, though I was, but because I needed to know something. I needed to know who truly loved me and who loved what I could give them." He pulled out his phone, pressing play on a video file. Laura's voice filled the ballroom, crystal clear through the sound system Maria had rigged earlier. "He's actually gone. I was perfect. Everyone believes it. I should get an Oscar for that performance." Laura's face crumbled. Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably, the truth settling over them like ash. "But it gets better," Philip continued, playing another clip. This time it was Laura and Marcus, their voices intimate and damning. "Wait 6 months, then we'll go public. After that, we're free. Finally free." Marcus tried to move, but Maria's gun stage trained on him. "Don't," she said quietly. Philip looked at his wife, his widow, his would-be murderer, and felt nothing. Not anger, not betrayal, not even satisfaction. Just cold, calculated clarity. "I faked my death to test your love," Philip said, his voice deadly quiet. "But instead, I discovered you helped arrange the real thing. The parking garage, the hitman, the security breaches. All of it. You didn't just wish me dead, Laura. You paid for it. You pulled the trigger." "That's not..." Laura started, but Philip held up his hand. "The difference between your plan and reality," he continued, "is that I don't die easily. And I don't forgive betrayal." He turned to face the crowd, addressing them all. "Some of you stayed loyal. Some of you waited to see who'd win. Some of you..." His eyes found the faces of people he knew had been talking to Marcus, planning their own moves. "Thought this was your chance to move up. Here's what happens now," Philip said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Anyone who betrayed me has 24 hours to leave my city. After that, I hunt you down. Anyone who stayed neutral gets to prove their loyalty again, slowly, painfully over time. And anyone who stood up for me when they thought I was gone," his eyes found Maria, "has my eternal gratitude." He turned back to Laura, who was crying now, real tears this time, tears of fear rather than performance. "Please," she whispered. "Philip, Don't," he said simply. "Don't insult us both with more lies." He nodded to his guards. "Mrs. Dean and Mr. Valdez have property they need to return. Escort them out. Make sure they understand they're never welcome in my city again." As they were dragged away, Laura screaming, Marcus silent and calculating even in defeat, Philip finally allowed himself to breathe. Philip Dean spent his entire life building power, but in death, he discovered something more valuable than fear. He discovered who truly loved him. The resurrection is coming, and Laura Dean has no idea her dead husband is about to walk through those doors. Subscribe right now because the confrontation you're about to witness will be absolutely epic. The ballroom remained frozen in the aftermath of Philip's revelation, the weight of exposed conspiracy hanging in the air like smoke. Laura had been escorted to the side of the room, flanked by two of Philip's guards, her perfect composure shattered into jagged pieces. Marcus stood similarly contained, his earlier confidence replaced by the cold calculation of a man trying to find an escape that didn't exist. Philip stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the families who'd come to mourn him, to divide his empire, to celebrate or lament his passing. Now they watched him reclaim his throne in real time, and the smart ones were already recalculating their allegiances. "Philip, please," Laura's voice cut through the silence, desperate and raw. "Please, you have to listen to me. I do love you. I was scared. They threatened me." Marcus said he'd kill me if I didn't help him. I had no choice. The lie was so transparent, so desperate, that several people in the crowd actually winced. Philip turned to face her, and his expression was carved from ice. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't insult everyone in this room by pretending you're a victim. We all heard the recordings. We all know you were celebrating my death while I was supposedly bleeding out in a parking garage." "I was playing a role," Laura insisted, tears streaming down her face, real ones this time, born of fear rather than performance. "I had to make them believe I was on their side, so I could." "Stop." Philip's voice cut like a blade. "Just stop. You had 18 months to come to me. 18 months to warn me, to tell me the truth, to ask for help. You chose conspiracy and champagne instead." He turned away from her, dismissing her as thoroughly as if she'd ceased to exist, and addressed the room. "For years, I searched for loyalty in all the wrong places. I built my life on power and fear, thinking that if I was strong enough, wealthy enough, dangerous enough, I could protect myself from betrayal. I was wrong." His eyes found Maria, standing at the edge of the crowd, her weapon still drawn, her focus still absolute. Even now, even in this moment of victory, she was protecting him, always protecting him. "Maria Torres has worked for me for 10 years, Philip said, and the room's attention shifted to her. "She's taken bullets meant for me. She's executed my orders without question. She stood beside me through wars and negotiations and the 1,000 small betrayals that come with this life." Maria's expression didn't change, but Philip saw her hand tighten on her weapon. "When I died," Philip continued, and his voice softened slightly, "she refused to believe it. While my wife was planning her next move with my enemies, Maria slept in her car outside the funeral home. While Laura was celebrating with champagne, Maria was hunting down the conspiracy that had been built around me. While everyone else in this city was carving up my territory, Maria was protecting every inch of it like her life depended on it." He walked toward her slowly, and the crowd parted like water. When he reached her, Maria's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, but her stance remained solid, professional, controlled. "You protected my empire when I couldn't," Philip said, speaking directly to her now, his voice low enough that only the nearest people could hear. But in the silence of the ballroom, his words carried. "You mourned me when no one else did. You loved me when I gave you nothing but danger and distance." "Philip," Maria started, but her voice caught. Philip reached for his left hand, twisting the wedding ring that had meant nothing but lies and calculation. He pulled it off slowly, deliberately, and let it fall. The gold band hit the marble floor with a sound like a bell tolling, rolling in a slow circle before settling at Laura's feet. "I was testing for love in a marriage that never had it," Philip said, still looking at Maria, "when real love was standing beside me all along." The ballroom held its collective breath. Philip extended his hand to Maria, not as a boss to a second-in-command, not as a king to a soldier, but as a man to a woman who'd proven everything words couldn't say. "I built this empire alone," Philip said, "but I won't keep it alone. Not anymore." Maria stared at his hand for a long moment, and Philip could see the war happening behind her eyes. Professional distance versus personal truth. A decade of controlled emotion versus 3 days of raw grief that had stripped away every defense. Then she holstered her weapon and placed her hand in his. The simple gesture sent a ripple through the crowd, gasps, whispers, the sound of a power structure realigning in real time. Philip pulled Maria closer, and for the first time in 10 years, he saw her as something other than his most trusted soldier. He saw her as the woman who'd loved him quietly, fiercely, without expectation or demand, for longer than he deserved. "You're sure?" Maria whispered, barely audible. "This changes everything." "I'm counting on it," Philip said. Behind them, Laura made a sound between a sob and a scream. "You're choosing her? Over me? After everything we had?" Philip didn't even turn around. "We had nothing, Laura. Just 3 years of excellent acting on your part and willful blindness on mine. But that ends today." He looked at his guards. "Mrs. Dean's accounts are frozen. Her access to all properties is revoked. She has 24 hours to collect her personal belongings and leave the city. After that, if I see her face again, I won't be as generous." "You can't do this," Laura shrieked. "I'm your wife. Legally, I have rights." "You're a widow," Philip said coldly. "Legally, you have nothing except what I choose to give you. And I choose to give you your life. That's more than you gave me." He nodded to the guards, and they escorted Laura out, her screams echoing through the ballroom until the heavy doors cut them off. Marcus went next, silent and calculating even in defeat, already planning his next move from whatever hole he'd crawl into. When they were gone, Philip addressed the families one final time. "Anyone who stood with my wife or Marcus Valdez has 48 hours to make amends or make arrangements to leave. Anyone who stayed neutral gets one chance to prove their loyalty. And anyone who protected my interests while I was gone," he squeezed Maria's hand, "has earned their place at my table." The families began moving, some approaching to pledge renewed loyalty, others slipping toward the exits to cut their losses. The Empire was already recalibrating, adjusting to the fact that Philip Dean wasn't dead, wasn't weak, and wasn't forgiving. But Philip barely noticed. His attention was on Maria, who was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before, vulnerable, hopeful, terrified, and completely, devastatingly honest. "I meant what I said," Philip told her quietly. "Every word." "I know," Maria said. "That's what scares me." Philip smiled, a real smile, maybe the first genuine one he'd worn in years. "Good. I've spent 10 years being scared alone. Time to be scared with someone else." They walked toward the exit together, hand in hand, leaving behind a ballroom full of people trying to process what they'd witnessed. The king who'd died had risen. The widow who'd mourned had been exposed. And the soldier who'd stood guard had been elevated to queen. Outside, the night air was cold and clear. Maria stopped on the steps, looking back at the mansion, at the life they were walking away from and towards simultaneously. "What happens now?" she asked. Philip pulled her closer, feeling something settle in his chest that he'd been searching for his entire life. "Now we rebuild. Not on fear or power or calculated alliances. On something real." "Truth?" Maria asked. "Truth," Philip confirmed. "And loyalty that doesn't need to be tested because it proves itself every single day." They descended the steps together, and somewhere behind them, in the wreckage of his old life, Laura Dean was learning the hardest lesson. You don't measure love by what someone promises in comfort. You measure it by who stands beside you when the world thinks you've fallen. Philip Dean had learned that lesson the brutal way, by dying and discovering who mourned him genuinely, who protected him fiercely, who loved him without condition or reward. He'd tested the wrong person, but in doing so, he'd found the right one. And that made all the difference.